Thank you, David. First of all, I want to start by thanking Together We Remember once again. Hopefully you're getting plenty of thanks on every hour for putting this together.
Thank you.
I know it's been a marathon for you, and I also know we're getting feedback about how much people are valuing each of the sessions. So you've done a terrific thing here, and we're all grateful. I'm Kate English, and I'm the Executive Director of the Educators Institute for Human Rights, and I'm joined by our Deputy Executive Director, Kim Klett, who's here to assist with any technological needs and field Q&A toward the end of our session. I would like to begin at the request of Together We Remember, and with a practice that I hope that we incorporate moving forward in everything we do, by acknowledging that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Anacostan, Piscataway, and Manahoac peoples. We want to pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. And that location is based on Washington, D.C., where our offices are based. The Educators Institute for Human Rights was founded in 2011. It began as an all-volunteer organization run by museum teacher fellows for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. All of us were full-time in the classroom when we started and doing our work since 2011, in addition to our full-time classroom responsibilities. Many of our staff still are full-time educators. This year we got a grant that allowed me to work full-time for the organization from the Bilo Chacon Foundation, and we are grateful to them for supporting our work. Today we're connected globally, united in a fight against mass atrocities to build sustainable peace. And peer-to-peer collaboration is at the heart of our approach. We're informed by experts such as our guest today, Professor David Crane. I keep wanting to say Dr. David Crane and give you a PhD instead of a law degree. But we work with experts in any number of fields relating to atrocities prevention. Our current scope of work includes initiatives between educators in Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cambodia, Argentina, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and so we were so grateful for the previous session and hearing from survivors from DRC, and we've just started doing work here in the United States. Our guest today for the Together We Remember event is Professor David Crane. Professor Crane served over 30 years in the federal government of the United States in several capacities. He was director of the Office of Intelligence Review. He was Assistant General Counsel for the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he was appointed to the U.S. Senior Executive Service. He also was a Waldemar A. Solf Professor of International Law at the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General School. From 2002 to 2005, he was the founding Chief Prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, an international war crimes tribunal, and he was appointed to that position by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. In 2005, he was a guest professor and then became a full-time professor for Syracuse University College of Law, and as I understand it, retired in 2018. Well done, sir. And currently, you are on the Leadership Council of the American Bar Association's International Law Section and serve as a co-chair on the section's International Criminal Court Task Force. We also know that you have an outstanding website. You founded Impunity Watch, which a number of us follow. I first met Professor Crane in a big audience of museum teacher fellows in 2011, where my colleague Drew Bider and I had the chance to speak with him afterwards. Drew continued in his relationship with Professor Crane, I'm getting all kinds of titles, on the I Am Syria project, and involved EIHR personnel in the International Humanitarian Law Roundtable, which I was able to attend this past fall and spend some more time with Professor Crane. I want to thank you very much, Professor Crane, for being with us today. I feel that the voice that you bring to this topic is one that we may not have heard from as much, the idea of justice and accountability and the role that it plays in remembering atrocities and in preventing atrocities. And so with that, I'm remembering a conversation we had in preparation for this conversation. And you spoke a little bit about, I think it was 1962, and you had an opportunity to visit Dachau. And could you tell us about how that may have impacted your choice to go into this field?
Well, thank you, Kate, and my greetings to everybody around the world. It's a pleasure, and what an amazing several hours that we've been having, and I'm proud to be a small part of this, and I'm looking very much forward to a great conversation over the next hour or so, and talk about the importance of justice and accountability for victims of atrocity. It's a good question, Kate. Back in 1962, my father was stationed in Germany. I was 12 years old. And I had an opportunity to take a tour of, at the time, the full standing Dachau concentration camp. And as a footnote, it was liberated by American forces 75 years ago yesterday, I might add. And I was struck by the horror. The tour guide took us through this horrific piece of land. And I remember they took us into the ovens. And of course, this is just 18 years ago after it was liberated, and you could still smell death. And to this day, I still can smell that horrific moment. I'm not sure whether that had anything to do with me becoming a chief prosecutor of an international war crimes tribunal, but it certainly told me that human beings deserve more than just being horrifically disappeared in the way that it took place in the Holocaust. And so when I was given the honor and the privilege of representing the people of West Africa and account for the murder, rape, maiming, and mutilation of over 1.2 million human beings, I stepped up to that challenge, and I had the privilege of seeking justice for those victims, which we did. So it's a great leadoff question, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you all this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you're from.
Well, thank you for that. What I'd really like to start off with is a little bit of an overview of the role that justice, accountability, the rule of law, how has that been a part of the history of atrocities? And I'm thinking, most of us probably know something about the trials in Nuremberg. What was going on before that? What kind of accountability was there for crimes and atrocities?
Well, it's a great question, an important question. I call the 20th century the bloody 20th century. I could be off on my research, but over 200 million human beings perished on non-natural causes through various kinds of wars, conflicts, and atrocities. Of those, a little over 100 million of those human beings were destroyed by the hands of their own governments. Up until 1945, there was no accountability for these atrocities. And so that's why Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal Nuremberg, is so significant. It's a crossing of the Rubicon. It's where mankind, the international community, after the horrors of World War II, decided to take people who commit atrocities and take them before the law and hold them accountable before the law. And so 1945 was very, very significant. In fact, we'll be celebrating the 75th anniversary of the creation of the International Military Tribunal Nuremberg on 8 August of this summer in London, where they signed the London Charter, creating that important event. And of course, Robert H. Jackson opened the court in November of this very same year, 75 years ago, where he stood up before the tribunal and began the process of holding the Nazi leaders accountable for what they did in World War II in Europe. After that, through the Cold War, international justice went by the wayside as the world struggled through the bipolar world of the East versus the West. And nothing was done until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1993, where once again we had a horror begin in the Balkans, and then shortly after that in Rwanda, and the world recoiled in horror, but instead of doing nothing, as they had done in the Cold War, they actually stepped forward and began to create, as what we call, and I'm a founder of this concept called modern international criminal law, where we see the beginning of the international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, followed shortly after by my tribunal in Sierra Leone, and then Cambodia. And of course, in here, we see the Rome Statute created in 1998, where the International Criminal Court was created. So between 1993 until around 15 or so, we call this the age of accountability, where the world stepped up and held heads of state, their henchmen, accountable for what they'd done to their own people. So that's where we stand. That's the importance of Nuremberg. It was the cornerstone by which we began our work in modern international criminal law to hold those accountable.
When we're doing teacher trainings, we have a lot of discussion about the importance of the use of language and precision in how we represent events, different atrocities. And a lot of time we spend looking at the original definition that was adopted in 1948 of Raphael Lemkin's word genocide, whether the statute that created that policy. Moving forward, we see that there are a lot of interpretations. There is some disagreement on how that particular the 1948 statute is put into play. What do you have to say about the term genocide and its strengths and its limitations?
Well, throughout the history of mankind, individuals, rulers, whoever have destroyed people in whole or in part for what they were, but we didn't have what we would call under international law a crime until 1948, when Raphael Lemkin and his idea of genocide, the killing of humans, became an international statute, the Genocide Convention. And we moved on from there. There are 4 international crimes. There's war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and then recently the crime of aggression. Genocide is one of those. Now, I don't want to go into a law lecture, but the Genocide Convention really kind of requires that we have a specific intent to destroy a peoples in whole or in part. And if that is met, then there's a possibility that a genocide could be charged. If it happens, though, and most nation states have signed the Genocide Conventions, if it's found to be a genocide, then legally they have to do something about it. And this is where the challenge of politics comes in my world of international criminal law. The bright red thread of this discipline is politics. Is once you find genocide, then you have to act. And diplomats and politicians don't like to be forced to act under law. And so we tend to, and I have found that there's a shying away of the word genocide. That doesn't mean that individuals who are victims of an atrocity are not going to seek justice, but there is a hesitation of saying the word genocide. But genocide also is a specific intent crime. In other words, you have to really have a smoking gun to show, in other words, someone directing somebody to kill a peoples in whole or in part. If you don't have that smoking gun, then it's very difficult to charge and get a conviction on genocide. Now, you can charge in the alternative, and we've done this many times, and that is war crimes and crimes against humanity, which are general intent crimes, and you don't have to have that smoking gun, that direction, that letter, that statement by a head of state or a guerrilla leader directing that these people be destroyed in whole or in part. Don't want to go too far down this road from a law lecture, but the point is that genocide is an international crime. Once one finds a genocide, then one has to act on that. And as a chief prosecutor, I would have to show that there was a specific intent to destroy a peoples in whole or in part.
So when we think of all of the ramifications of justice, it may feel to someone who wants to take action like they may not have a role in the justice aspect of an accountability. They may, in terms of aid or speaking out for victims, but is there a way that people could be, that individual actors could support justice and accountability?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, after the age of accountability began to wane and we've entered into the age of the strong man around 2015, a lot of the work that we had been doing had been kind of cast aside as nationalistic and populistic leaders turn inward for solutions, what have you, but the atrocities still continue. And so we have found that we have other ways by which we can keep the flame alive, to keep investigating, to keep people aware of atrocities around the world, whether it be Yemen, Syria, Venezuela, Myanmar, wherever the tragedy is taking place. And so we've seen a rise of grassroots organization like the one that you had, Kate, and the ones that there are many are sponsors of this particular great event over these next several hours. People standing up, doing the right thing, continuing to talk, to discuss, to advertise, and to assist in investigations. And so I founded the Global Accountability Initiative 2 years ago, well, more than that, but a couple of years ago. And our job is to take university students under the sponsorship of professors and investigate the same way that we investigated while I was in West Africa in places such as Syria. The Syrian Accountability Project was the cornerstone of the Global Accountability Initiative. And now we have the Yemeni Accountability Initiative, and we've just created with our Canadian partners at Toronto and McGill University, Venezuela Accountability Project, where we're actually doing a crime base, a matrix, a conflict map, as well as draft indictments of individuals neutrally who are committing those international crimes that I discussed. But this is just an example of non-governmental organizations' grassroots efforts to continue the efforts of documenting, investigating, developing cases against individuals who kill their own citizens. And of course, the international community has stepped over the Security Council, which is politically bound up and not able to create international type of mechanisms. And they've created what we call the International Independent and Partial Mechanism System for Syria, and we've just recently created one for Myanmar. So we're still doing the work. We're still moving forward. We're still trying to develop methodologies by which one day, when we do in fact create a tribunal, a court, either domestically, regionally, internationally, we can hold these individuals accountable. It's important for our viewers to understand is that there are no statute of limitations on international crimes. So in fact, we can prosecute anybody anytime if we have a proper case, as long as they are alive. And you can see this going on in Europe, where we are prosecuting individuals who were camp guards in those horrific concentration camps back in the 1930s and 40s. We're still prosecuting them. So again, we'll continue to do so. This is kind of an interesting vignette. BBC was interviewing me, kind of lamenting the fact that will President Assad ever be held accountable for what he's done to his own citizens in Syria? And I kind of chuckled and I said, yeah, one day there's going to be a knock at his door and it's going to be me. So we'll get him. We have a tremendous case against him, as also the co-author of the Caesar report, where we documented the first time direct specific evidence showing Assad and his henchmen committing torture, killings, exterminations of their own citizens in detention facilities. The world began to gasp and realize the horror of what President Assad and his henchmen have done to the people of Syria. So again, another vignette. I'm full of vignettes, but you know, Charles Taylor, who I took down, he was the sitting president of Liberia, and for the first time in history, a sitting head of state was taken down by the stroke of my pen on his indictment. But just 12 years ago, 13 years ago, Charles Taylor never thought he'd ever be held accountable for what he had done to the people of West Africa. And now he sits in Her Majesty's maximum security prison in England for the rest of his life for what he did to the people of West Africa, particularly Liberia, and most specifically Sierra Leone. So what I really want to say here with these vignettes is that justice may be slow, but justice is inevitable. We can keep moving forward, and we will hold these individuals accountable for what they've done in Syria and other places.
As you're saying, as you're telling these vignettes, I'm wondering what situations you may be aware of that you feel we don't know enough about. We've been talking about some of the more contemporary events, but I'm always concerned, you know, that particularly with all of the things that we're caught up in our own domestic here in the U.S. and in any Western country, where we just may be missing something an atrocity that's occurring because it's not put in front of us or we're not digging deep enough. So what things in the world today would you hope would get more attention, where we could take more action?
Well, this all goes to our social media paradigm. And the fact that we get so much information thrown at us through so many directions all the time, 24 hours a day. It's very difficult to keep the attention of the world, to keep the attention of humanity focused on any one particular tragic event or atrocity. So that's a real challenge. But it also, in some ways, there's a flip side to this, Kate, and that is that it's very difficult to hide an atrocity anymore. With social media, which really only kicked off just a little over 10 years ago. You could slip some things through, you could hide some things, you could manipulate the press, the print press, even television and radio. If you were a local dictator or a thug, you could limit the knowledge of what was going on. And we saw a lot of that in Central America and the horrors that were going on there. But it is very, very difficult for a dictator, a thug, a strong man anywhere in the world these days, other than a few blank spaces in the world, such as North Korea, and there's not many more than that, where they can't hide an atrocity. It's going to come out through some type of social media mechanism, and then the rest is there. But your point is important, is that there's so much coming at us in not even 24-hour news cycles. Now we're talking minute by minute news cycles that are coming across our screens, whatever they may be, so that it's difficult to focus people on a particular event that needs looking at. And also there's just the human factor of becoming jaded to all of it.
Yeah.
And just moving on. So these are challenges. We have these challenges in West Africa. We have these challenges at Nuremberg and Rwanda and Yugoslavia, but we deal with it, we're aware of it, and we work the problem, and we continue moving forward. And I think this is, again, I really want to stress to our listeners, our viewers, in remembrance, is that we're not giving up. This is a 24 hours of hope and determination, and to assure you that there are many, many people around the world, many of us very good at what we do, who are not going to let these people get away with what they're doing.
Thank you for that. That is a hopeful point and an interesting way to consider the work of the courts. And it leads me to the question naturally. It's a nice segue. I wanted to ask what you think the role of justice, of records, of rule of law, of legal courts of law, and so forth. How is that a part of remembrance? Why is it significant to remembrance?
Well, remembrance is multidimensional. It's even cultural, and people remember things or celebrate things differently around the world culturally, and that should not be stepped over. There's no one particular way by which we remember why and how we move forward from a tragedy. All cultures have a correct way of dealing with it based on where they're coming from. I think that's really, really critical for us to note. But domestic, regional, and international tribunals have a place. But I think it's important that part of the remembrance is that these are criminal trials. They have and are bound by rules of procedure and evidence. The prosecutors are mandated to prove their cases beyond a reasonable doubt, each and every element of that particular crime. And so the prosecutors present a criminal case. Now, of course, throughout the trials, as I did in West Africa, there is also a kind of a history with it, but we are not preserving history, even though it's part of history. We are preserving evidence and preserving a record to hold individuals accountable who then committed international crimes. Mm-hmm. For people who don't quite understand that, and I respect that, it's important that these international tribunals, I'll specifically talk about that, are not history historical record-keeping entities. They are criminal courts. They are part of history. They are part of the history of the atrocity and the accountability, but they are not charged with preserving the history. And I think that that's really, and that's why your question is so important, and so important in this Day of Remembrance, is just that. You have to put these tribunals in their proper place, their important place, but they're only a galaxy and a star of remembrance entities which allow mankind to move forward, but not forgetting the past. So I think it's really kind of important that we kind of place the tribunals in a way that they are part of the history. They are not preserving the history. And I hope that that's helpful to our viewers and listeners as how you figure out where the tribunals in law and justice is. Yes, it is a record. Yes, it is important. And historians will draw upon and use that criminal record. It's a public record in most instances to piece together a history, but it is only part of history, not the history. And they're not charged with preserving history. They're charged with seeking justice under law and preserving the evidence that will prove cases against those who commit international crime.
And what role does it play when we get to, as Stanton described in his 8 or 10, however you choose to count them, when it comes to denial, and when we think about remembrance and how denial, sometimes these things are, well, they're in conflict, but they, how the courts, what's the court's part in fighting denial?
Well, the courts are legal entities charged with seeking truth and justice. And so they're irrefutable. These aren't kangaroo courts. These are courts that are created under statute. These are courts that follow international law. These are courts that follow evidentiary and legal principles that have been tried and true for centuries. And so we just don't rubber stamp these issues. And so it's very difficult to refute and to deny something that actually happened, because it is a legal process by which we enter into evidence the actual happenings of the atrocity. So you cannot deny the Holocaust. The International Military Tribunal set the record as to what took place, and that's important how tribunals do. Same way in Rwanda, same way in Yugoslavia, same way in Sierra Leone. Up to 1945, when we had atrocities, that was a challenge. One could deny it, but there was no entity other than through open statements by victims, by witnesses that took place. But as over time, and then in history, history could skew that atrocity and mold it and shape it in a way that actually the truth is not found. So we need, as part of that history, we need accountability mechanisms to in fact become a cornerstone by which throughout history, for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now, people can go back to the record of that particular criminal proceedings of that particular tribunal. That's irrefutable. You cannot deny properly entered in evidence and truth, properly documented, properly recorded, with little tainting, no influence. And so it's very, very critical. And this is where modern international criminal law is so important, and which I helped found, was that we have pushed deniers away. You're always going to have nations, peoples, others, conspiracy theorists saying it didn't happen or it didn't happen this way, what have you. That's all part of the challenge of history, is to weed through that and try to seek some type of truth. But tribunals are locked in stone. Historians cannot deny it, step over it. It is a rock in the middle of the stream of history that cannot be moved.
That's a really wonderful image to have, a rock in the middle of the stream. Could you share on a personal note, is there a moment that you look back to that where I understand. I'm having conversed with you before. I don't mean to put you on the spot or make you seem immodest. I'm just going to ask you, what are you proudest of that you've accomplished in your career?
That I've served. I've served my country. I've served humanity. I've been given a lot of privileges to lead paratroopers in the 101st Airborne Division, to lead wonderful federal workers in the intelligence community, to stand in front of a court of justice and to seek justice at the federal level. And then, of course, Kofi Annan gave me the privilege of representing destroyed peoples in West Africa. Frankly, to be honest with you, the thing I'm most proud of is I'm a grandfather. We get it right down to it, of two cute little girls who live in North Carolina. That's my most proudest achievement. But at the professional level, it's just again continuing to help establish the rule of law internationally, so that humankind can be better for that. And so, looking back over 40 years of an incredible career, and it's just that the privilege and the opportunities given to advance causes that I believe in, and that is essentially justice and the rule of law.
So the flip side of that, what's been the most frustrating? What aspect, particularly in terms of justice and accountability, what have you been the most aggravated by?
Well, again, the bright red thread of modern international criminal law is politics. And so you have to be able to work with the political ramifications, the diplomatic ramifications, the practical ramifications, the cultural ramifications of your general strategy when you're going into a destroyed part of the world to seek justice for a destroyed peoples. And so you run into a lot of politics, but you work those politics, you develop relationships, and you try to seek justice, which is your focus, and that is justice for the victims. So the politics can be frustrating, but I think looking back on it at this very moment, to be quite candid, is my personal frustration is that the age of accountability, which we started back in 1993, kind of came to an all stop circumstantially and also politically around 2015. All the major tribunals, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone, were just logically finished. We had completed our mandate. So there really was not a international tribunal extant, even though the Cambodia courts are there. They are actually extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. They have an international twist, but in reality, they're domestic courts. But we have, of course, the permanent international criminal court, and that's the only one that's there. But with this rise of strongmen around the world who are stepping away from the rule of law and using, instead of the rule of law and an international approach to global peace, but a nationalistic approach to looking at the world, across the world, to include the United States, a lot of the efforts that we have started back in 1993, which we used the Nuremberg trials as a cornerstone, it's become a real challenge. And we see that atrocity accountability at the international level is beginning to wane with the challenges of the strong men around the world. And the United States' withdrawal from the international community as a leader has really hurt the efforts because, again, your viewers probably know this, they may not know this, but actually the United States built the house by which we have done all of our work. They were central in all of the creation of all of both the trials at Nuremberg with Robert H. Jackson, with the modern international criminal law system in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, somewhat in Cambodia. But the United States non-participation in the International Criminal Court and then its final withdrawal from just the world community as a leader in the rule of law since 2016 has really hurt our efforts to continue to the international piece of seeking atrocity. So it's very frustrating to me. But as I said at the beginning of our discussion, it doesn't stop us.
Right.
And we'll continue to do that through the various mechanisms that the UN has put together, the grassroots efforts of all of you out there working hard and seeking justice, as well as the important role that non-governmental organizations do in order to keep up the fight. So we're in a phase right now. Hopefully, we will see a return of the United States as a respected country under the rule of law. And when that happens, whenever that happens, we'll see a continuing and a surge of a movement towards international accountability.
Thank you. When you think back on testimony, perhaps from survivors or conversations in preparation for testimony, I'm not clear 100% on how your role may have worked in terms of interaction directly with survivors as part of the legal process. But are there any particular survivors or testimonies that have stayed with you?
Well, again, up into the creation of the International Tribunal in West Africa called the Special Court for Sierra Leone, international communities tended to step over victims, never listen to the victims. They usually were not even located at the scene of the crime, unlike the Special Court for Sierra Leone and at Nuremberg, where we were literally at the crime scene. My headquarters was we had crime scenes in and all around us. And so when I was putting together my general strategy, I thought that it was very, very important to do something that we all learn in law school, and that is ask your client what happened. Never been done before at the international level. And so I created the world's first outreach program, where I literally walked the countryside listening to the victims of that horror story that took place in Sierra Leone, and heard their views of what justice was, what happened, what have you, and allowed them to get to know me. So I literally spoke to tens of thousands of victims throughout that region, listening to them tell me horror stories that will haunt me the rest of my life. And I'll just give you a couple of them. In 2004, I was at a town hall meeting in McKinney, which was the former headquarters of the infamous Revolutionary United Front, which had a particular way of destroying human beings by cutting off body parts. And I was talking to a group of Sierra Leoneans, and usually it was in amazing places, auditoriums, burned out buildings, out in open fields, under banyan trees, what have you. Wherever I could speak to the people of Sierra Leone, I was there. And so I was in a kind of a semi-destroyed auditorium in a school in McKinney, and I was standing in front or among them. And my technique was, even though my close protection officers were not pleased about it, but I would stand among the people and talk and listen to them and let them tell me. I wanted to make sure that they felt that I wasn't above them or any better than them. And I was standing there talking, and we were in McKinney at this town hall meeting, and I was about 2 hours into about a 3-hour session. And a young man stood up in front of me. He was about 12 years old. He was in tatters. He was sickened by various ailments that you can get in West Africa. And he was deaf. He had been deafened by combat. He was a child soldier. But in the atonal voice of someone who could speak, but who had become deaf, looked me right in the eye and said, "I killed people. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." And he fell into my arms crying. And I hugged him, and I had tears in my eyes, and he just wept. He was 12, and he was a murderer and a rapist. As I was holding him, as he was weeping, people began to weep themselves, to shift uncomfortably. There was a death quiet. And about 20 feet away from me, off to my right, a young woman stood up, and she was missing half her face. And I was told later it had been stuck in a pot of boiling water by the RUF, and she was holding her child. And through her cracked lips and her one good eye, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Seek justice for us." So why am I telling you this? Well, I'm telling you this is that we tend to talk about atrocity crimes and various international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity. You've heard me say that over the murder, rape, maiming, and mutilation of over 1.2 million human beings. Yes, but what we, and this is important, and I always reminded my office in Freetown, Sierra Leone, is we have to constantly, every day, remember the reason we're here is to seek justice for victims. And the outreach program allowed us to understand their pain and suffering. And it's important for our viewers and listeners to appreciate that numbers don't matter, whether it's one person or a million people. What I want you to remember when we're in this day of remembrance is just that 12-year-old child soldier and that young mother, and then multiply that by the numbers. We have to personalize, we have to humanize these atrocities, because if we don't, we're not paying homage to the victims of the atrocity. And to me, the worst atrocity is that we have an event and the victims disappear into the sands of time as if they never existed. No accountability, no justice, no truth. It's just they never happened. And this is where we have the challenge with the Armenian genocide, is that the Turkish government is trying to make that go away, denying it ever happened. And yet the world community is not going to let that happen and not allow that to happen. But to me, the worst atrocity is if someone is destroyed in some event, and that event is never recorded, never accounted for, and denied. And it becomes then that victim never existed. And I think that that's really for all of us to understand. It's for and about the victims, and remembrance is for and about the victims. We don't forget them. They didn't just disappear into the sands of time as if they never existed.
What challenges are we facing now? How is COVID-19 taking a toll, an even greater toll on victims of atrocities at this point?
Well, there's two challenges. One of which is practical. Right now, we're all trying to survive. And a lot of the work that we're doing has just come to a stop, or it's just idling at this point, understandably and appropriately. We don't want to expose those who work in these organizations to unnecessary risks until we beat this. So that's the challenge. And so atrocity accountability as we know it is still moving forward, but it's moving slowly. But sometimes we're at an all stop. And also there's the reality is that nobody really at this point, as they're trying to figure out what they're going to have for dinner tonight or where their job is, they're not that interested in what's going on in Syria or Yemen or Myanmar or Venezuela or what have you. They're interested in feeding their families. I get that. It's to be respected, needs to be dealt with, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're kind of in a survival mode. But the thing, and I just wrote an op-ed article about this, and I'm really concerned about is that we're in the age of the strong man. There are a dozen or so very powerful men that are part of three of the largest, most powerful countries in the world, but also strong men around the world using to their advantage the powers that they're granted in order to protect their countries from the virus. And we even see this in the United States, where under law and appropriately, we give our head of state powers to deal with an emergency such as the coronavirus. Now, our founding fathers never contemplated a president that was basically a criminal and someone who had no respect for the rule of law. And so he has huge powers, as to many strong men around the world, or strong men wannabes. And so they're taking this special powers granted to them domestically by various parliaments, congresses, whomever, under their own constitutions and law, and using it to their advantage to strengthen their own political position. Yeah. This bears watching everyone across the world, that these powers should be taken away or minimized or at least monitored, so that when we get through this together as human beings, that we don't see the strengthening of this really bizarre situation, this nationalism and populism that you see burning across the world, not seen since the early 1930s, that we have a intractable situation where they are now placed under their own domestic laws in positions where we can't do anything about it anymore, that they now have that power. Most liberal democracies need to be careful. But we're also seeing that in other countries as well. So just be mindful of it. This is a kind of a flip side to something I never contemplated in my career, that I would have to be worried about heads of state placing themselves in autocratic or tyrannical places permanently. And we've already seen that largely in Russia, certainly in China, and across the globe. And we have a particular political situation in the United States where we have someone who is quite enamored by power, by personal power, and a lack of respect for the rule of law. And so we just have to be mindful as citizens of liberal democracies to watch out, give the power where it's necessary, let the power be used to protect us, but then that power needs to be taken back appropriately under law.
I have a couple of other questions, but I want to check in with my colleague, Kim Klett, and see if we've had anything come up in the Q&A.
Yeah, we had a couple on Facebook Live. I'll start with the first one. Professor, are you working with anyone regarding China and the treatment of the Uyghurs?
I'm very much aware of what China has done to the Uyghurs. I am not personally working on that, but I work with people who are monitoring that situation. One of the challenges that we have in international humanitarian law and international criminal law is that most nations will not go to war over human rights violations. In fact, it's never been done before. And so we're not going to those countries that have the ability to influence China, that are doing things with the Uyghurs, which are essentially crimes against humanity. We're not going to go to war with China over that because it just doesn't done. And so the political reality of this is that at this point, there's nothing to be done. It's being monitored and data is being taken. But the reality of it is, modern international criminal law is by far not perfect. We have to live with the political realities of where we are, and we cannot, other than following the rule of law, we cannot force a country such as China to stop doing what they're doing, because they just won't, because they don't realize that nothing is going to happen to them other than living up to their international legal obligations of not committing crimes against their own people, such as in Tibet and the Uyghurs in Western China.
I think we have time for one more if you have one, Kim.
Yeah. The other question that came on Facebook Live is, what do you think of forms of homegrown retributive justice, such as the gacaca in Rwanda?
Well, again, I think, and again, this is a term or a phrase I coined back when I was chief prosecutor, is the justice we seek, the justice they want. There are many types of justice in the world, and I believe in that, and I respected that, and I spoke to the people of West Africa about that in my town hall meetings. And that is, what's justice to you? Justice to you may be different than justice for me from a cultural point of view. International criminal law, it tends to be Western oriented. I call it white man's justice. But I am all for local use of local justice mechanisms that cultures have been using in some cases for thousands of years to take care of that. In Sierra Leone, they had the paramount chief system, where we saw paramount chiefs in taking care of local justice that they've been doing for centuries. And we recognized that, we used that, we told the people respected that, and I tried to differentiate international justice with their cultural approach to justice. So I support local efforts. I believe that There are different types of justice, and they all should be respected. The international community doesn't have the definition of justice, the only ability to seek justice. There are many ways to seek justice, and we should respect that and use it where we can.
Thank you very much, Kim. Professor Crane, is there something we didn't ask you, something that you would like to end with that we may have skipped over?
Well, no, not really. I just want to say that really, as we go through this important day, these important hours, that we continue the fight, that we do not look the other way, and that, you know, people always ask me, what can I do? You know, and a lot of law students want to be a chief prosecutor of International War Crimes Tribunal. And that's just not going to happen. But, you know, it really, as I told my people, a smile is the most precious gift you can give anybody every day. If you start every day with a smile, if you do something kind for something as often as you can, that's a step forward in atrocity accountability. Everybody can do something. It's just, and they should. But, you know, it's not one of these situations where you focus it on from being a chief prosecutor or working in a tribunal. You look on it on being a better human being, and perhaps that's the way we should look at it. So my compliments to the sponsors of this and people who came up with this great idea. Let's continue the fight. It's important, and justice will be done, I can assure you.
Professor Crane, thank you very much for your time today. I've learned a lot. I particularly appreciated the stories, the vignettes that you were sharing, the ways that made understanding your work more personal, something that can be very formal, making it something that we connect to as human beings as well. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for all the work that you've done and that you continue to do on behalf of victims and survivors, and to create that record of accountability and justice.
Thank you.
And David Estrin, are you there? And how are we doing?
I'm still here. working the phones on the back end.
All right. Well, all of us at EIHR want to say thank you for the time that you've given us to have this conversation with Professor Crane. And on behalf of our entire team around the globe, thank you for giving us an opportunity to be part of this day of remembrance and to building hope in the community that you've created.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you, Professor Crane and Kim. I know this is the beginning, hopefully, of more conversations and collaboration.